Welcome everybody, my name is Drew Powell. Welcome to this webinar, Achieving Net Zero Emissions Challenges and Opportunities. I have 30 years experience in the oil and gas energy industries. I'm a chemical engineer by background, although I've got a very wide exposure to other disciplines, from the geosciences through to renewables and so forth, technical work through to economics. Background includes a mix of operations, engineering, management, advisory services, and so forth. And I've been the last 15, 16 years with GaffneyCline. I've been more recently part of GaffneyCline's new energy transition team, which was formally developed about 3 years ago. So let's kick off. We've got a lot of slides to go through. I'm going to move very quickly. Apologies if that is too quick for some people, but you can always contact me after the event. First of all, the usual disclaimer slide, which I think everybody sees and has to produce these days. So let's start now with some background on the net zero position globally. Put some sort of framework around the discussions that we're going to go and talk to a little bit later. Excuse me. So global greenhouse gas emissions obviously are very high, about 50 gigaton per annum at the moment, excluding land use and so forth. Of that, we've got about CO2 comprises about 40 gigatons per annum, and the total energy related emissions are about 32 gigatons. So very large numbers, significant scope 1 and 2 emissions from the oil and gas industry. Only 121 countries have stated a net zero obligation at the moment. So looking at the slide, Paris Agreement, obviously we all know about. We know about the 2 degree, 1.5 degree targets. IPCC, really in order to achieve any sort of sensible target, the net zero by 2050 has been touted and commented on, and that is very much the focus for global personnel. Energy transition pathways that have been presented, a number of policies that have been promulgated, stated policy scenarios, delayed scenarios. The key one here really is a sustainable development scenario, which is commonly referred to as the SDS. Very much focusing on a significant amount of emissions reduction. And also, there's been more recently a net zero emissions by 2050 case to look at a more optimistic case as well. Okay, fine. Sorry, there was a bit of lag in the loading there. So some of the decarbonisation headlines that you've seen in the media quite recently. Obviously, the US, a lot of news in the US, rejoined the Paris Agreement. There's a new infrastructure plan with several $1 trillion worth of likely expenditure. But likewise, in other parts of the world, China, Brazil, Japan, net zero targets being presented. E&P majors all coming out in the press with significant net zero targets. Exploration bans in a number of parts of the world. Combustion engine bans, obviously here in the UK where I'm based, we were looking at phasing out of combustion engines, pure combustion engines by 2030, but there's a number of other states and countries that are doing similar. And we're also looking at in the EU through the Euro 7 emission standard similarly. Financing, obviously a lot of talk in the media about green financing, a lot of large financial institutes pushing away from fossil fuels and heading into renewables. Greenhouse gas emissions reporting is starting to come to the fore as well. We have the likes of the Task Force of Climate-Related Disclosures coming, the recommendations from that, the TCFD, being presented by the UK government, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. And also in the US, the SEC have been talking about that as well. And just recently, in the last couple of weeks, the 5T Hydrogen Fund, $1 billion fund, which is going out there for pure hydrogen plays and looking at investment in the latter part of this year and into next. So a lot of news out there, a lot of positive news, but still, really reflects the necessity of where we are and the and meeting the net zero targets. So, although the global driver is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, we've got to be cognizant about, obviously, the other drivers, global drivers, and one of those is population growth. This slide here is showing on the right-hand side forecast of population growth in thousands. So we're up to well over 9 billion by the time we get to 2040. In addition to that, sorry, I should say that growth really reflects about 1.1% growth per year, which doesn't sound a lot, but in a compounded effect, it's still quite significant. In addition to population growth per se, there's obviously an increase in the middle classes, and that comes with a commensurate increase in energy consumption per capita. So although population growth is 1.1% a year, global energy growth is about 2.3, 2.4, those sort of numbers. You'll also see from the graphic there that the distribution of emissions, and although Europe and the US have started very high, they seem to have plateaued and certainly starting to come down. Other parts of the world, the developing areas of the world, are really reflecting on higher CO2 emissions going forward and continuing from the historic trends that are shown there. So, new drivers for energy sector, low carbon and ESG investments. So shareholders have really been putting pressure on a lot of companies recently to push harder into low carbon. The shareholder resolutions that we've heard about in the press really been reflected on a concern about capital risk and the ongoing risk to the company's health going forward. So a lot of capital, as it says there, is now moving to power and renewables, and then oil and gas, and historically it was the other way around. Over half of new energy generation capacity is now renewable. A lot of further risk assessment. We're seeing that in our work. A lot of risk assessment work, very much on the carbon emissions, is coming to the fore. This is really driven by the impacts of carbon taxes, policies, and regulations that are coming in as well. In addition to that, the large oil and gas companies are feeling a lot of pressure and are responding likewise with a lot of media news about their steps to reduce carbon and also improve their renewables investments. There's some numbers shown there, relative billions of dollars that have been put in by some of the majors, but obviously that still reflects on a very low percentage of global capex when it comes down to it. In addition, many of the oil and gas companies are starting to look at the increased collaboration, which I think we all recognise is very much required in order to achieve low carbon targets. So the Oil and Gas Climate Initiative is one that is very well publicised going forward. So really, people like BP and Exxon and Shell are really, although they are feeling some pressure, they are also responding likewise. And obviously, Total are also seem to be leading the charge there with significant investment in low carbon. Sorry, the slides. There we go. Okay, and then of course we have to consider the impact of carbon pricing and the effect on the value of oil and gas players. This is a very simple schematic showing the economic limit of a typical oil field. The field in question has got reserves of 4.6 million and an economic limit of year 17 if there was no carbon pricing. The left-hand graphic shows the effect of a $50 a ton carbon dioxide pricing, and you'll see the economic limit advances to year 15, and there's obviously a commensurate reduction in reserves. The right-hand slide shows a sort of a more progressive carbon tax with a high pricing of $150. That has a commensurate effect of reducing or bringing forward the economic limit to year 12 with a further reserves drop. So, quite clearly there is an impact on carbon pricing on the actual book value of many oil and gas companies through impacts on their actual reserves and resources. TCFD we talked about is very much coming into play for a lot of oil and gas players. The US Securities and Exchange Commission likewise has announced recently public support for climate change disclosures, probably starting in the near future. And as I said earlier, the UK Financial Conduct Authority has, working with the London Stock Exchange, looks to have implemented or is consulting for further implementation of TCFD requirements going forward. There are some already in play for larger companies from 2021 reporting 2022 onwards. Let's move then to specific net zero for oil and gas sector. So net zero is a simple statement and simply means whatever greenhouse gas emissions are produced that are offset, that an offset compensates for by absorbing the equivalent emissions in some form. So in order to get to net zero, we require three primary things which are listed in which I've listed to the left in a little bit more detail. Emissions reductions is the first one. Obviously, that can be achieved through both the elimination of things like flaring and so forth, but also improved efficiency of operations. The second one really is replacement of energy with low carbon solutions, so such as things as biofuels, renewables, replacing oil and gas derived energy. And the third one really is offset or sequestering the emissions. So again, those two are listed separately, but offset would be something like investing in reforestation or land use protection. There's also the opportunity there, and that's being considered for entire value chain consideration. So from the upstream through to the downstream, if you look at 1, 2, and 3, there may be options in certain areas to obtain credits which can be counted towards to other areas of operation as well. Sequestering the CO2 obviously is the area of focus that this presentation goes into, and that being CCUS, carbon capture, use and storage. Sorry, I should have said on the right hand side there, that's a classic abatement curve which sort of reflects the net volumes of both emissions and technologies for offset and for efficiency gains as well. So you'll see this curve, marginal abatement cost curve, when it comes to carbon management activities. Let's move on then. Obviously, the way oil and gas is produced needs some form of systematic carbon management. We need this in order really for societal acceptance and investor confidence in the oil and gas sector. Many cost-effective solutions to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from oil and gas do exist. From marginal price perspective, they start with energy efficiency. We also have tackling methane emissions, integrating renewables, as well as low carbon electricity supply. And clearly, obviously, there's also minimizing flaring and associated gas and venting of CO2. But really, the one that's shown in the chart there, really that reflects the greatest opportunity, is the reduction in methane emissions, which something which needs to be considered. And there are programs looking at methane reduction and technologies therefore in order to achieve that. Sorry, I should also mention the last bullet point there, carbon capture, utilization, storage, CCUS, really does require public policy support, and we'll talk about that separately in a few slides' time. Right, so let's move on to key area of the net zero model, and that's CCUS. Current CCUS status, obviously, it's a very critical part of the whole mix, about 40 million tonne per year, captured from roughly 25 projects, give or take. The number of projects is reported does differ depending on your source, but of those 25 projects, only 2 are actual power generation plants. Some of the others are chemical or tend to be related to enhanced oil recovery and that sort of thing. Saying that, 20 power generation CCUS projects are in development at the moment globally. Global government policy to date has been generally insufficient to make CCUS economically viable. That probably has flipped now. Historic carbon pricing have been too low, but of course they are now starting to, carbon pricing and tax credits are starting to be provided, which allow for CCUS to be part of the mix. As it says there, 2018, the US federal tax credit 45Q, that is commonly used, provides a certain guarantee of value for carbon dioxide storage. California has also implemented provisions for CCUS as part of that, the Californian transport fuel requirements. Europe, through the emissions trading system and the allocation of pricing through market pricing, I should say, there is starting to generate interest also CCUS and underpin CCUS capacity in Europe. And China has recently also included CCUS in its most recent 5-year plan. However, saying that, CCUS is quite an expensive add-on to any project. CCUS is widely quoted from around about $40 to $200 a ton of CO2, although in some instances where you have producers with high concentrated CO2 emissions, that can be somewhat lower. Future CCUS, so we've looked at sort of the current status. Let's look at the future now. Clearly, CCUS has a key part to play, but particularly in places such as cements, chemicals, and steel, where there is very little option. It's very complicated to bring any other solution in, possibly hydrogen in some instances. The SDS scenario we mentioned earlier, coming from the IEA, targets about 450 million tons by 2030. Of which 310 million tons of carbon capture would be coming from power generation at that point in time. And then pushing that further along, you were looking at over 5.6 gigaton by 2050. So in the short term, of course, the forecast is very much in the next few years of only about 50 ton per annum of CCUS capacity. So really what we're looking at is very remarkable and unprecedented increases in the development of this industry. So CCUS in particular is quoted as providing around about 15% of cumulative emissions by 2060. In terms of CCUS, I think most projects at the moment are looking at being part of industrial hubs or industrial valleys, as some people may call them, whereby there's a regionalized industrial system which is utilizing a common set of infrastructure. Saying that, on the CCUS, there has been a recent, very significant recent uptick in reported projects and progress. If you look at all the media, of course, there's a whole plethora of different CCUS projects all progressing quite strongly at the moment. The benefit also of CCUS, it combined with direct air carbon capture and also bioenergy with CCS, it does provide for actual negative emissions. So in other words, whereby even in very optimistic cases, we will still be seeing some carbon emissions through even with efficiency improvements and new technologies and so forth. CCUS does actually provide for us to pull carbon out of the atmosphere and actually provide for negative emissions to allow us to balance the net zero model. All right, let's move on to a few technical aspects of CCUS, which need to be talked about. So firstly, carbon capture in underground storage facilities is considered very safe, very low likelihood of CO2 ever escaping. There are a range of standards for storage that have been developed to formalize best industry practice, such as the ISO standards and a few of the others that have been mentioned on the screen as well. A multitude of different reservoirs can also be used, and that's quite a positive benefit for CCUS. And there's a few mentioned there. Depleted reservoirs are the obvious one, but clearly we can still use it to a certain degree in EOR, which probably to a lesser volumetric effect. But there's also really the untapped saline aquifer rocks, which give us a greater opportunity there. And there's also coal seams and some coal bed methane opportunities as well. So in terms of overall capacity for CCUS storage, there are many different opportunities, many of which haven't really been considered in detail yet. So we've got some impressive calculations now on screen related to the 3 pillars of carbon dioxide storage: capacity, injectivity, and containment. I'm obviously not going to go into those. I do know people who understand them, but personally, they're a little bit beyond me. But those 3 pillars really much drive the whole story of carbon dioxide storage. Let's talk about some of those. Capacity, how much CO2 storage is available. I think if you look at the general academic and industrial media output, it's very difficult to nail down exactly how much geological storage is available. I've seen figures from, as I've quoted there, from 8,000 to 60,000 gigatons, but in practice, I think we can pretty much guarantee that it's going to be higher than that when you consider all of the opportunities that would be available. In addition to that, we've also got the SPE have recently developed the storage resource management system, which allows for classification and categorization of capacity. So that in complementary to things like the ISO standards for CO2 storage is starting to allow a framework to be developed through which we can manage investment and so forth. So and that little image there is coming from the SRMS. CO2 trapping mechanisms. There are a number of different mechanisms through which carbon dioxide can be trapped in a reservoir, starting with the very basic structural trapping through to mineral trapping through actual chemical reaction subsurface. I'm not going to go into too much detail there, but it isn't obviously just a simple perspective of putting it into the reservoir. There obviously is some effects once it goes in there. And that leads into the next slide, which really talks about geochemical reactions. There are two issues really for CO2 storage projects that come to the fore: handling and minimization of corrosion of the metallic elements, usually limited to sort of ensuring dehydration. But there are other species such as oxygen and hydrogen sulfide which can play a part and need to be considered. There's also an issue related to the design of cement isolation, specifically CO2 resistant cements. Interestingly, the introduction of CO2 into a saline aquifer would usually lead to some form of self-sealing cementation. So again, the whole issue about geochemistry does need to be considered, and certainly geochemical reports in addition to geomechanical reports become very important for CO2 storage. Site characterization and monitoring is a significant part of the cost of a CO2 storage project, which is a little bit unlike an oil and gas sector where you sort of plug and abandon and walk away. There is in CCUS a perpetual responsibility requiring that ongoing monitoring and verification. And obviously that monitoring and verification requires financing. So we have here a very basic diagram showing some work that we historically have done looking at the post-injection site care of CapEx, OpEx, and the approximate unit cost per ton of CO2. Okay, there's often concerns about the likelihood of rock failure and possibility of induced seismicity. I know that's a very common theme in the discussions I've heard. Geomechanics and reservoir management is obviously far more important than in classical oil and gas developments. And also in terms of need to monitor the CO2 injection that is in place, 4D seismic or fiber optics do lend themselves to the ongoing monitoring of such facilities. Let me just check for the time. Okay. Right. Carbon capture, some of the technologies. We have, I'm not going to go into detail on this slide, it's very busy, but in principle, the 4 main aspects are chemical absorption, physical separation, membrane separation, and oxyfuel combustion, which I'm sure if you have any interest, you can do some further background reading, but I'm not going to bore you with all that at this point. But really, just the takeaway from this slide is those are the 4 main categories. The technology potential, it does, there are some mature elements to CCUS in terms of technology, but there's also some novel technologies which have been introduced as well. So it's very much a mix of the two. It's very difficult to assess the exact cost reduction potentials for the technology because it's sort of, there isn't that much empirical information to allow us to do that. But, you know, as we said earlier, CCUS does provide some significant options for carbon negative technologies as well. So that is obviously there's a lot of potential there for CCUS. And again, that slide really pretty much shows, you know, a general discussion of pre and post combustion developments and some of the opportunities there, which, you know, again, please feel free to skim through the slides later. Okay, so policy support. The addressing of CCUS, as I mentioned earlier, requires private finance and public policy support to provide a business case. Ultimately, private finance will be required for the major rollout of the CCUS market, and the risks at the moment, to a certain degree, are perceived too high without public policy support, governmental support. Obviously, public support, policy support is also driven by many a country being dependent on the near-term use of fossil fuels and the need to decarbonize. So that is going hand in hand with government policy. There are many carbon pricing schemes around the world, carbon tax, carbon emission systems of one kind or another. But generally speaking, the average is still sub $10, which is really doesn't provide any sort of financial incentive for CCUS, although I accept that in certain parts of the world, those numbers are significantly higher. Policy requirements, really capital grants, operating subsidies, R&D support, quantity support mechanisms, whatever government policy support is available really is required. And so I've just mentioned there at the bottom of that slide, some of the policies that are out there, things like the ETS, the EU's Innovation Fund, UK Budget and Energy Act. And in the US, obviously, we've got the tax credits and the low carbon fuel standard for California, which we talked about a little bit earlier. Private investors will struggle, though, at the moment, because, of course, there is still, you know, where there is government involvement, there's usually uncertainty in things such as carbon pricing and long-term policy, which needs to firm up. CCUS is also unique in really having been a collaboration of upstream, midstream, and downstream players and different parts of the sector working together. There's obviously an interdependency risk, and that tends to lead into an interdependent FID, where one party is looking at the other party to go to FID before the other party, and in fact, all parties' FIDs tend to be somewhat connected, and that is proving to be a little bit tricky at the present time. And of course, there's unlimited and perpetual liability in the event of leakage. So again, that risk tends to play on the mind of investors, and as I said before, requires public sector support. All right, let's move on to the hydrogen sector very quickly. Hydrogen, for those who have not kept up with the market recently, very quickly, the key players here are green hydrogen, hydrogen produced by renewable energy sources, and the other two really are the brown, black, and grey hydrogen, which is made by fossil fuel burning without any sort of mitigation, abatement of carbon emissions, and blue hydrogen, where we have those unabated technologies combined with CCUS in order to make the production of hydrogen low carbon intensity. Hydrogen, I focus primarily on Europe because Europe has taken the lead very much so in hydrogen development. But hydrogen is very much considered as being a solution for what are called the hard to abate sectors. These sectors we'll talk about a little bit later, but it's things like long distance transportation, shipping, places basically where electrification will be difficult to achieve. And Europe pretty much has taken the lead in this, although I appreciate, again, other countries are starting to develop their own strategies. Europe developed its Green Deal in 2019, which is a roadmap for the energy transition and the inclusion of hydrogen in that. Hydrogen strategy, there's a plan to move to about 14% of the energy mix by 2050, which again is, as I say, working hand in hand with renewables and electrification. And the hard-to-abate sectors there are listed as well. There is also a feel that green hydrogen will be the long-term solution, but in the immediate future, there really needs to be a focus also on blue hydrogen to get us to a point where we have a hydrogen infrastructure in order for the long-term green hydrogen to feed into. LCOH, for those who aren't aware, is levelized cost of hydrogen, a sort of a benchmark figure for the cost of hydrogen. Blue hydrogen at the moment is about, I'm sure I'll get shot down for this, but about $2 a kg for blue hydrogen in the EU. For grey or black sources, it's about 150. So you can see we're about 50 cents in there for the provision of carbon capture. And again, in terms of carbon price needed for equivalence of blue and grey and black, we need about in the sort of 55 to 90 euro a ton bracket. Green hydrogen at the moment is perceived to be slightly more expensive than blue, about 250 to 5. Saying that, the presented and reported figures for green hydrogen are coming down all the time, and it's very likely green hydrogen by 2030 is going to be sort of on a par, if not cheaper, than blue hydrogen. I'm not going to go into detail on the next couple of slides. I'll provide this and you can review this at your own leisure. But in principle, the European hydrogen strategy is a phased approach, phase 1 and 2 and 3, depending on the period. Phase 1 is a very modest commencement of electrolyzer green hydrogen production in the next 4 to 5 years. Phase 2 is pretty much where the utility scale development starts to really take hold, and that we will start to see significant production of hydrogen. And then phase 3 is sort of more the long-term mature market and large-scale utility development. And of course, there's going to be tweaking of the carbon situation through the emissions trading scheme. The ETS will start to increase, and we will see a more incentivization of hydrogen development. And also there's a number of other activities, collaboration of bodies, public, private, academia. One of those is the Clean Hydrogen Alliance, all being driven by the EU to push forward the hydrogen strategy. Again, I'm not going to go through this in detail, but if you look at some of the numbers here that have been talked about in Europe, 2030, we're talking 20 to 40 billion euros. You know, we're looking at also the renewable energy in order to achieve this is again in the hundreds of billions of euros. So again, we're talking large amounts of money for the development of this sector. And if you look further down there, there's talk about how that might be achieved through different EU plans, funds, and different mechanisms as well. The key point to the bottom there is the development of regional hydrogen hubs. Because of the nature of hydrogen, really the development of isn't going to be little standalone projects. It's going to be in localized or regionalized hydrogen developments, which people are referring to as hydrogen hubs, hydrogen valleys, or hydrogen clusters. A typical cluster is shown on this slide. You can see there, you know, the interfacing, the relationship between the renewable energy, the carbon capture from the fossil fuels, along with the utilization, and how it all ties in. But you can see that really you need a regionalized solution in order to achieve this. This isn't something that can be readily done on a sort of very standalone basis. So again, it lends itself to regions such as near ports, near the coast, where there is existing significant industry in whatever countries we're talking about. Supply demand forecast globally, 120 million tons of hydrogen is being talked about. Most of that is going to be pure hydrogen. In 2050, we're looking about 135 to 600. Again, very wide-ranging quotes from the media and from different sources. So you can see the uncertainty there that people are talking about in terms of not really knowing the position for hydrogen in the future. Current EU consumption is somewhat less than that, and obviously you can see therefore the necessity, the growth demands that will be required, which really are unprecedented, really. In addition to that, you know, there's a lot of talk about where Europe will get its hydrogen from. It can't produce all of it, so it's looking already at importing hydrogen. There's already talks about imports from the likes of Saudi, Morocco, and Russia. Okay, hydrogen, technical issues with hydrogen. It's not all, it's not rose-tinted glasses, unfortunately, hydrogen. There are some issues. There isn't any hydrogen storage history apart from salt caverns. And that to a certain extent isn't going to provide the solution globally. So, putting hydrogen into depleted reservoirs for storage is going to be a bit of an issue. There are also geochemistry issues, metallurgical issues which need to be considered. On the facilities side, compressors are impacted by the use of hydrogen. Compression ratio can be affected, and gas turbines, because of the use of hydrogen, would need specific low emission technology in order to reduce NOx emissions. But saying that, there is a lot of progress. European gas turbine manufacturers have got together to form a body, the EU Turbines Trade Body, and have committed to development of hydrogen operation by 2030. So it is progressing, but saying that, there is still development still needed. Pipeline transportation, it's got a lower density than methane, but it has, in balance to that, it has lower viscosity and density. And therefore, the amount of energy you can put through a pipeline in hydrogen terms in relation to methane terms is approximately about the same. But one key issue, of course, that hasn't really come to the fore yet is the water demand required for green hydrogen production, and where you're going to get the volumes of water required for hydrogen in the volumes that we're talking about. But obviously, it also has been very well known as an industrial gas for many years. Downside risks, I'm not going to go through this in detail again, but hydrogen is a very volatile gas, which obviously we have to be cognizant of. Competition with batteries, many observers believe that batteries will take a lead and hydrogen might struggle to compete. One of the major truck makers recently has announced that they will be moving to battery tech and not to hydrogen, which is a little bit of a blow to the hydrogen market, and that will need to be considered. Battery tech is also progressing very rapidly, and it may be that battery tech allows for, in the very near future, for advances in energy storage that's, at the moment that would be again unprecedented and have an effect on the overall energy markets. And likewise, ammonia may well be considered for shipping, where it can be controlled in an environment which is easy to look after. It is, comparable with hydrogen as a fuel, but there are also many benefits for ammonia in terms of energy density and so forth. And I know, obviously, a few players have started to look at blue ammonia as an option for shipping, as well as ammonia being introduced into some engine designs as well. Hydrogen also requires policy support. The costs, as we've talked about, are quite high at the moment, and utilizing hydrogen will require government finance and regulatory support in a similar way to CCUS, really. There also has to be consideration of, in this context, first mover support. The first person, the first organization to progress will no doubt be, a herald of the technology, but will probably be exposed to the higher costs, and therefore they will need to be supported by policy and so forth. Regulations also are very problematic for hydrogen. At the moment, it's considered as a flammable gas, as a dangerous product, and in order to be able to transport it in volume through pipeline or vehicle, will require certain regulations to be modified. So we're coming to the end of the presentation now. NetZero Middle East. I've just added a few things in here, given the nature of the audience. Clearly, NetZero is still high on the radar here in the Middle East as well. The circular carbon economy is developed in the region, and it will be providing the framework for carbon management in the region. The emissions at the moment obviously are dominated by Saudi Arabia and the UAE. Both states have introduced national strategies to decarbonize, but obviously there still needs to be further work in terms of details of those strategies. There are a number of carbon reduction projects already. I've listed a few there, ADNOC and Aramco, and in Qatar as well. And there are quotes of about 100 million ton per year of CO2 capture capacity in the region by 2040. So, that's a considerable amount of effort in the region and potential expenditure. The levelized cost of electricity and levelized cost of hydrogen in the region are also, would be very positively seen in the region because, of course, of the supply of renewable energy. Both photovoltaic and also wind power is very well provided for in the region, and of course there are already some projects such as the Neom City and the Helios Green project, which have been reported, looking at possible exports of low carbon fuels there, and of course a few other players that have also been mentioned recently in terms of significant announcements. So really very much a lot of potential in the region, given its location for renewable fuels, possibly because of its location to Europe and Southeast Asia, could provide both Japan and Europe with significant volumes of ammonia or hydrogen as required. My final thoughts on this really, on net zero, hitting net zero by 2050. Quotes are $1.2 trillion per year, each year to hit that, which is about 1 to 1.5% of global GDP. So it's not outside the realms of possibility. But of course, the cost of not hitting net zero is significantly higher. There's still a lot of significant carbon negative technologies required to hit net zero. We talked about direct air capture and the BECCS systems as well. Hydrogen will be in the mix, blue hydrogen under commercial pressure from green hydrogen as soon as 2030. But I think most commentators see that hydrogen will be there in some form. It's likely to be complementary with electrification and renewables. And I don't see it really as being in competition, but there is very much it needs to work in hand. Pyrolysis is a new technology that I'd say it's a new technology. It's been newly presented in a form in order to as a low carbon technology for the production of hydrogen. Again, knocking on the door, as are many other new technologies. Every day you see a report about some new technology, and the opportunities they provide. The talk about nuclear and the options there for nuclear, I'm just going to leave that with a question mark. Obviously, nuclear is very low carbon, but it has obviously its own problems. And new opportunities that are developing. We're seeing suddenly a growth in abandonment, decommission, recycling requirements for renewable systems, such as wind turbines and the requirements to decommission and recycle them. And this is opening a whole new window of opportunity for business. And also monitoring and verification of CCUS sites. This is something which is going to become very large scale and in demand, and again something that will be required going forward. So very much these are unprecedented times, very much a global industrial revolution and likely to be in only 30 years. Yes, I think that's the last of my slide. I hope you found that very rapid run through the whole net zero picture interesting. Thank you for your time. And for the very large part of the audience, happy Ramadan. I also like to thank the sponsor, ADNOC, SPE, and Inform, and I'll pass back to
Thank you, Drew, for an exciting presentation, an exciting topic. And sorry for the technical issues. I wasn't able to connect at the beginning of the seminar. Today's seminar is a kickoff of multiple webinars for MEOS 2021, where we plan to host several keynote speakers over the coming months to share topics that are related to the interest of the industry, as you have seen today, as well as to the theme of MEOS 2021 conference, which will be held later this year on November 28th to December 1st in the Kingdom of Bahrain. I hope to see you all there, and I hope you all enjoyed today's topic, and to see you in the next seminars. Thank you again, Drew, and thanks all for attending this webinar. See you later.